Hello and welcome to Criminal Record, the Daily Record's weekly crime show. My name is Norman Sylvester and I'm crime reporter with the Daily Record. My special guest today is author and journalist Jane Hamilton. She's going to tell us about her new book. It's about the serial killer Peter Tobin, titled Hunting Shadows. Tobin died in 2022 in hospital after being sentenced to life for the murders of 3 women, but is believed to have committed many more. Jane, tell me how you first came across Peter Tobin and what inspired you to write this book.
So I first came across Peter Tobin on the day that Angelica Klook's body was found back in 2006. I was working for the Sunday Mail at the time. I was one of their senior investigative journalists. And we had been looking at, Angelica started as a missing person investigation. And obviously because we were a Sunday newspaper, the story had broken earlier in the week, but we were keeping an eye on it. I think you were at the Sunday Mail at the time with me, Norman, and I'm sure you remember, there was a lot of talk in the office at the time about this young Polish student that had gone missing. And it seemed very, out of character and, not something that, anybody was expecting, least of all her family. So we kept an eye on it during the week while our sister paper, The Record, covered the story. And by the Saturday, on the Friday, Angelica's body was found. And on the Saturday, I was in the office in Glasgow and I was sent round to the church to be at the scene, basically, because we knew that obviously a body had been found. So I was there from the very first day of that inquiry. And as the weeks went on and we started to learn more about Peter Tobin, our news editor at the time decided that, that was going to be my story. So I was, sent off to investigate Peter Tobin, and it spiraled from there. And, over the last 20 years, I've investigated Tobin. I've looked at him many times. I've written, dozens upon dozens of stories about him. And, the book now, at the time when I was working that story, I covered all of those cases for a long time. And as you know, there's periods where, legal restrictions mean that we can't report on everything that we know. And a lot of the details only become public much, much later. And I always felt that there was a bigger story there about how he managed to operate, and about not just about him, but about the women whose lives that he cut short. And I wanted to tell the full story, not just, the headline version of it or the little snippets that people get. I wanted to, do away with some of the myths about Peter Tobin. But writing the book was about putting all of it in one place, and with the perspective that comes from the time and the distance, since I first started looking at Peter Tobin.
Tell us a bit about, we know 3 victims. You're convicted of the murder of 3 women. Angelica Klook, who was a Polish student working in a church in the centre of Glasgow. Vicky Hamilton, who disappeared in 1991. And Dinah McNichol, who had disappeared the same year. Tell us a bit about these victims and how the police came to identify Tobin as the prime suspect for these 3 murders.
So Tobin, Angelica Klook was the case that brought Peter Tobin into the public eye. He was kind of known before that to police, not, specifically to the general public. He was a sex offender who operated mostly in England. So, he wasn't really on our radar up here in Scotland. And, he did commit some, sexual offences before Angelica. But it was Angelica that thrust him, straight into the public eye. And from there, he was 60 years old. And when you look at the victim, Angelica, she was a Polish student who had come over from Poland to learn, better English to broaden her horizon. She was ambitious. She wanted to go back to Poland. She loved languages, but she also, she fell in love with Scotland, and she came over here for a few years during the summer. And, she came from a religious family, and she was volunteering at St Patrick's Church in Anderston, and she was living in the chapel house. And she was a kind girl. She was friendly. She loved life. She loved her family, and she was just very. She was described by people as being, very helpful. She was beautiful. And she just, wanted to enjoy Scotland, and she never thought she would be able to travel away from Poland. So to come to another country was, a massive big thing for her, and to learn about a new culture. And
she'd been quite trusting
really well.
She'd been quite trusting of Tobin. We know he was working at this time as a handyman using an alias, Peter McLaughlin, but she would have no reason to have suspected him at all.
No, none at all. And from what we know, her and Tobin had, a friendly relationship. She would help him with, odd jobs round the church. And, she had no reason to, feel uncomfortable in his presence. So when Angelica's body was found, police said, this is a man of 60. The violence of the crime and what he did to Angelica, police were saying, we don't think that this is a man who's killed for the first time. And unknown to the public, prior to that, I had interviewed two of his wives, and a picture was forming in the background of a violent, controlling man with a history. We knew that he had previous convictions. We couldn't tell the public that, of course, because we were, waiting for the Angelica Kluck trial to begin, and we couldn't reveal to the public what we knew about him. It was clear that patterns were emerging, that this was a violent offender, and killing Angelica at 60 was not his first victim. So the police began to look at his history and what he might have been, involved in. And the picture, began to emerge of a man who had a history of assaults and coercive behaviour. He lived under different names and moved around the country. He had the kind of life that would leave gaps. And those gaps, it was reasonable of the police to think, how can we, we need to fill in those gaps, and we need to discover who this man really is. And I think, it was more than reasonable for them to ask whether there were more victims. And, they launched Operation Anagram, which was, set up to look at the life of Peter Tobin.
Right across the UK, this was what was unusual. It wasn't a kind of local inquiry to Strathclyde or Glasgow. This was an inquiry launched by Strathclyde Police, as it was then, but really involving every other police force in the UK. They would be asked to look at their records and anything that might match Tobin's kind of way he operated.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It wasn't a single force inquiry. It took in the whole of the UK, and I believe Ireland as well. And, every police force was tasked with looking at Tobin's, there was dates and times. Police were able to piece together where he, might have lived. And it was... Anagram showed how complex and fragmented Tobin's life had been. Different names, different addresses, different regions. And that inevitably raised, the possibility that cases that had never been linked to him. So it's just, it was a very, very complex inquiry, and there were, you and I know how many people go missing every year. So police would look at patterns of women who had gone missing in the time that they thought he was operational, which, we're going back to the 70s. In fact, they actually went back to the 60s. because we know that they looked at Tobin as being possibly Bible John, who, most people in Scotland will know that Bible John was a murderer of 3 women who was operational in Glasgow in the 1960s and would pick his victims up at the Barrowland Ballroom. So he was looked at in connection with the Bible John murders because there was aspects of his age and his movements that made the police consider it.
But that was right. That has been dismissed. I mean, you don't believe that he was Bible John. The Anagram kind of ruled him out, really, didn't it? He was elsewhere at the time of the second murder, and I think the DNA evidence kind of ruled him out as well.
Yeah, I mean, there was never enough evidence to charge him, with the Bible John murders. And personally, myself, I do understand why people connect the dots with him and Bible John, because, when you've got an unidentified killer and later, a convicted serial killer with a similar era and, similar geography, then the question is inevitable. And I know that people would look at the photo fit of Bible John and then look at the pictures of Peter Tobin and say, oh, he looks like him. And, the questions do become inevitable, but there was no DNA evidence to link Peter Tobin to Bible John. And there's been, police did try and fit, but there were other things, other factors. He had an alibi for the second murder. And, so whether he was involved in, one or other of the murders, and maybe Bible John is not a serial killer, but 3 separate murders.
3 separate individuals.
Something that we're never, we're probably never going to know. But, personally, I don't think Peter Tobin is Bible John.
We mentioned Operation Anagram there, and it looked at all the different addresses that Tobin had lived, multiple addresses over the years, through his relationship, through his 3 marriages and elsewhere, and identified a property he lived in Margate, in Kent, and that was where they did a dig and tragically found the bodies of the 2 missing women we talked about earlier, Dinah Nichol and Vicky Hamilton. Just tell me a little bit about that.
So during Anagram, police were searching various addresses linked to Peter Tobin. And, we know he was transient. He embedded himself in, lots of ordinary environments, rented accommodation, churches, religious establishments, that sort of thing. And one of the addresses that they had intelligence on, they dug up the back garden in Margate. He had spent a lot of time in Margate in Kent. And unfortunately, they, recovered the bodies of Vicky Hamilton and Dinah Nichol, which left no shadow of a doubt that, police were dealing with a serial killer. So, yeah, it was...
and he was subsequently stood trial for the murders of Vicky Hamilton and one obviously in Scotland, and for Dinah Nichol in England, and was given another 2 life sentences.
Yeah, and obviously there were still searches going on to see if they could link Tobin to any other possible victims, and there are some questions around certain cases, and I do talk about it in the book where I say that he was probably responsible for the X, Y, and Z murders, highly unlikely. Ones that I said that I don't think he is responsible for. And, what we need to remember is Peter Tobin was convicted of 3 murders. That's absolutely clear. And Anagram examined, many more to see, because of how long he operated and how he moved. And we've got names, like Jessie Earl and Louise Kay being discussed as, Tobin being the likely perpetrator. And that's because there are overlaps in the timing and the geography. But I should, stress that there's never been any conviction linking him to those, but police have always said, privately, that they do believe he was responsible for, at least, many more murders. I don't want to put a figure on it, but, if I had to and if I was pushed, I would say, possibly, up to 10 deaths that he was responsible for.
I was going to ask you about that. You mentioned the two, Jesse Earl and Louise Kay, who went missing, I think, about the early 1980s. And what the police discovered during Anagram was that wherever Tobin lived at that particular time, wherever that might be, there was women who went missing, wasn't there? There was quite a clear connection between where Tobin lived and women going missing around about that time.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, virtually every place where Tobin lived or worked or frequented, there were several cases where women had gone missing. The difficulty for police was, that there was very little evidence, in a lot of the cases, it was quite, his life was complex. It was very fragmented, and it was a difficult inquiry, because there wasn't always, DNA is seen as the great white hope of modern murder investigation, and everybody.
But you need other evidence, don't you?
DNA that a murder will be solved. You can find DNA, but that doesn't put a person as being the murderer. We know that police found lots of jewellery in Tobin's possession when he was eventually apprehended, and to date, not a lot of that, the owners of that jewellery have not been identified.
During the Anagram, they had a kind of root and branch look at the life of Peter Tobin, didn't they? They kind of went back to the beginning, 1947, he was born in Johnston, and tried to trace all these movements following that. And I think it'd be right to say that they discovered, I think, going through his bank accounts, it's upwards of, I think it was between 120 and 150 cars he'd owned. He used between 30 and 40 different aliases. He also had multiple mobile phone possessions. This was a guy, and also at the same time, he was married 3 times. This is a guy who was on the move all the time, wasn't he? And it's quite easy maybe to tie him in as a suspect for a lot of different disappearances, because he was really travelling everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't settle in any one place for long. Even during his marriages, he would, force his wives to move. With his first wife, Margaret, he made her move down to England. Sorry, his second wife, Margaret, he made her move down to England and, tore her away from her family. And, that was his MO. He did it with Kathy. He moved her away. He isolated her. What people need to remember about Peter Tobin as a serial killer is he was an opportunist. He wasn't methodical. And, we all see American crime dramas or, about serial killers, and we think that, they plan and they execute the murders, in a ritualistic or a flamboyant way. Tobin wasn't like that. He adapted, and he would embed himself in ordinary environments, as I've already said, churches, in relationships, rented accommodation, sometimes even shared accommodation. And what he did do was create access, and then he would exploit vulnerability. And he was an opportunist. So, and because he was so adaptable, when we look at the murders that he was convicted of, Dinah McNichol was a hitchhiker. Vicky Hamilton was a teenage girl waiting for a bus in a strange town. And the one, disparity with him was Angelica. She was somebody that he knew. He groomed her to, feel comfortable in his presence. He wasn't a planner, and Angelica was a spur of the moment attack. We know that from, the way the body was discovered, the ferocity of the attack. She probably fought back. So, you know, he didn't follow one sort of rigid pattern as a serial killer. Peter Tobin took advantage of whatever, you know, situation gave him proximity and control over these women.
Well, painted a picture of Tobin as a kind of itinerant individual travelling the country under different identities, carrying out attacks on women. But he was also married 3 times. And tell us a bit about his marriages, because one people might think, well, didn't the wife suspect anything? But he was a very controlling guy, wasn't he? He manipulated them to suit his kind of other purposes in many ways, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, you know, all of the women spoke publicly. I actually was the first journalist to interview his third wife, Kathy Wilson, and his only son, Daniel, back in 2006, before obviously the court case against him for Angelica had concluded. And we printed it after the trial. And, you know, Kathy painted a picture of when she met him, she was 16, and he was very charming. He was funny. He was older than her, obviously. But she was also, you know, a vulnerable teenager, and, you know, he played on that. And from what all of the wives said, and I also spoke to his second wife, Margaret, and she also described somebody who was charming, funny, you know, could be very loving. You know, at the start of those relationships, he was almost the perfect partner, you know, because he wanted to draw these women in, and to the point that, you know, he would covertly control them. You know, comments about what they wore, how they spoke, what they were doing. He would control their movements. You know, he would make sure they were in the house and wherever they went, he knew where they were, or he would go with them. So, you know, he was, you know, to all intents and purposes, a domestic abuser. He might not have always left bruises on them, but he would control them in other ways, and he would make them frightened. And then, as time wore on, he would start to, you know, lift his hands to them or attack them. And Margaret, you know, gave a very explicit account of what happened to her and what made her finally, you know, see him for the monster that he was. You know, he left her for dead. His first wife, Sylvia, spoke about him beheading their puppy. You know, and Kathy painted a picture of a man who was violent, controlling, would remove her from her family. You know, he isolated her, and you know, there was allegations of abuse, sexual abuse, and, you know, physical and mental abuse. So we know that, you know, with the women, he was testing boundaries of how far he could go and how far he could take it. And we know that while he was married to these women, he was obviously stalking and murdering young women.
Why do you think Peter Tobin got away with his murders for so long? It was just the time obviously we live in the modern era of CCTV, and everybody leaves some sort of digital footprint through their phone or laptop use or whatever. Why do you think Tobin got away with it for so long? These murders and attacks on women that we know of, three murders we suspect, maybe up to 10 others. Why do you think he got away with it for so long and over such a long period? Is it just, given the fact that all of these attacks were quite random, what's your feelings about that?
So, you know, it's easy for us all to sort of look at it now and think, oh, how did he get away with that? And, you know, how could he move from town to town without anybody knowing who he was? How could he just change his name and, you know, people accepted it? And, you know, the systems that we take for granted now, you know, in terms of digital footprints, you know, our digital bank accounts, passports, CCTV, DNA, these things just did not exist in the 70s and the 80s. In Scotland, we've got one unified police force, and every department speaks to each other. In London, you've got the Met. We didn't have that joined up policing in the 70s and the 80s. We didn't have agencies talking to each other like they do now. And we've seen that with other unsolved cold cases from the 70s, the 80s, the 60s, the 50s. We just did not have the every agency talking to each other, and sharing information. We didn't have the digital capabilities that we've got now, where information is sent in an instant, or where cameras are following our every move, where our license plate numbers on our cars are being caught by automatic number plate recognition, AMPR systems. So it would be very difficult for somebody now to disappear the way he would just disappear into, local communities. At one point, he was living within a religious sect, a commune, where it was, first name basis only. And these people took it on trust that this person was, okay, and there was nothing to worry about. Nowadays I think we're all a bit more careful. But of course the technology that we've got now would mean that, for somebody like, to try and do what Tobin did, and how he was able to fit into different places, I don't think it would be possible now.
I was going to mention that prior to that, the murder of Angelica Kluck, Tobin had spent, I think it was something like about 11 years of a 14-year prison sentence for the rape and sexual assault of two young women. He'd been charged with these offences in 1993, been released about 2004, and made his way up to Paisley, where he carried out an assault on a woman in his flat. Tell me a bit about that, and do you think that there should be more red flags on Tobin after he was released from prison, or was it just, given that he was on the sex offenders register, or was it just one of these, that was the era, that things weren't as kind of joined up then, as joined up thinking?
Yeah, I mean, obviously he attacked two 14-year-old girls in Havant in 2004. And he was eventually apprehended for that. About 6 weeks later, he went on the run after that, and he was apprehended for it. And it was, I'm not going to go over the details. It was a horrific, violent assault on two 14-year-old girls. And, he did receive a 10-year prison sentence. In fact, sorry, I think it was life, and then he served 10 years. And he got out and he came up to Scotland. We don't know what brought him up to Scotland. As I said before, his life is complicated.
He came to Paisley, didn't he, which was quite near where he was brought up in Johnson, so maybe an element of returning home at that time.
Say that again, sorry, Norman?
After he's released from prison, he came up to Paisley, and of course that was quite near where he was brought up in Johnston. Might be a kind of connection there.
Yeah, no, he was born in Johnston, so but he didn't live in Scotland, an awful lot. And I remember asking Kathy why he might have come up to Scotland in 2004, after he was released from prison. And I remember her saying, she found it odd because he came up to Scotland now and again, and he did have some friends up here, but it wasn't somewhere that he, would spend, most of his time was spent down in England. But when he did come up here, he, as we know, he committed an assault on a woman in Paisley. And, it was seen, the Havant attack and the Paisley attack, he was he was supposed to be on the sex offenders register and was supposed to be monitored. But as always, he disappeared. And we know he sprung up again in Glasgow in 2006 with the name Pat McLaughlin. In terms of red flags, I think at that point, people just assumed that he was, and I don't say this lightly, he was just another sex offender, and nobody, probably, there was no red flags to suggest that he was anything other than, a sex offender, a run-of-the-mill sex offender. And I say that in terms of, he hadn't been yet convicted of murder. So there was no red flags that this was a man who was going to escalate from sex offences to homicide.
We were talking earlier about the possible unsolved murders or unsolved disappearances of women that could be linked to. Given the fact that he's been dead almost 4 years now, would there be any, I'm just saying justification, but do you think that the murders should be reinvestigated? Obviously, using maybe the sort of new technology that's now available to officers. Would there be a justification for doing that? For example, we've got all these the jewellery and artefacts. I think there's about 37 that were recovered at various addresses where Tobin lived. Would you like to see a fresh investigation? To try and solve some of these disappearances?
I think the problem with that, Norman, is that Anagram was very extensive, and maybe when Anagram was they didn't have the technology that we have even now 20 years later. So would I like to see any more? I think, I would like the ones that we think that he's probably responsible for, Louise Kay, Jessie Earl. I think maybe police should go back and look at it again, using the the DNA methods that we've got now that didn't exist even back when Anagram was operational. So I think there should be another look at Peter Tobin's movements, because as I say, the DNA technology has advanced a lot more. I'm pretty sure after his death, there's a possibility that police did decide to look back at some of his cases again. He did take a lot of secrets with him to the grave. The jewellery, there's still not been any identified owners for most of it. Are they likely to, find anybody? I don't know. I'm really not sure on that one, because I do think if the DNA was there to be found, then we would know already.
I was just thinking in terms of, for example, Jessie Earl's parents and Louise Kay's parents and others who will probably suspect that Tobin was linked. Maybe a chance to give them a bit of closure, even if he's eliminated. There would, because the suggestion is this guy could have been one of Britain's most prolific serial killers. Yet at the moment we only know that he's carried out 3. There might be just on that level, just to give a bit of closure to the parents, wouldn't it? It would be worth revisiting.
Yeah, I mean, for closure for the families, that lots of unanswered questions for them, and I think the danger is it's all too easy to blame one monster for another monster's actions, and Peter Tobin was a horror in his own right, and I don't think that it does justice to families to label Peter Tobin as being responsible for the disappearance and or death of their loved one without any concrete evidence. And police have said themselves, the ones that they think that he's most likely responsible for, they just cannot gather the physical evidence for that. But I just I think it would be to bring the whole story together and look at how he operated, and how investigation techniques have evolved since Anagram was put together. Then possibly we could be looking at him again, just to give some of those families answers. But you're never going to be able to give all families answers. That every time there was a missing woman when he was operational, when Anagram was operational, people were coming saying, well, was he responsible for my relative? Is there a chance that he was responsible for this? And then you slip into that that territory where we are labelling him a monster for all. I think the more important question is how he was able to operate for so long, rather than giving an exact number for how many he might have been responsible for. And
just final question, Jane. Obviously, you've covered this story for the last 20 years or so. It's to be 20 years this year, the anniversary of the murder of Angela Kluck. How's that affected you personally? Because obviously you've spoken to family members, victims' families, you've spoken to the wives. How's it impacted on your own life? How has it affected you personally, covering this particularly distressing story?
Yeah, I mean, I talk about it in the book about, and I'm sure you, Norman, you've been a crime reporter for a lot longer than I have. I'm coming into my third decade, and you must be 40 years. So, and I'm sure that you'll agree with me that we've got a job to do, and we do the job. We write the story as best as we can, without being too intrusive and too. We always try and remember that at the heart of every story that we do, it's a human being. And there are some stories that stay with you. There are some stories that, you can't shake, you can't put out the back of your mind. You think about the families, you've got a relationship with them, and for me, I talk about it, there's a chapter in the book called The Weight of Witness, and, I go into some detail about what it feels like to be on the fringes of what is the worst time in people's lives. We are on the fringes of it because, we are reporting on people who have lost a much loved family member in horrific circumstances, and you take in all the detail. And it's very, you put it in a box and you think, I'll think about it later, but at the moment I've got a job to do. And my job is to tell the facts and tell the facts as impartially and as truthfully as I can. And then it's only later, maybe years later, that, you suddenly realise, and, for me, it was, when I finally left journalism, a couple of years ago, and I thought back to, my own behaviours and dark thoughts, and, I wrote a fiction book just after I left the Record, and it was a very, very dark book, and it was indicative of how I was feeling at the time. And I've said it before, any journalist who deals with crime day in, day out for a long time, and, your decades, I'm decades, I believe we've got a little bit of PTSD in us because we see the worst of what humans do to each other, and it's everybody says you've got to be impartial, and we do have that impartiality, but we're still dealing day in and day out with horrors and pain and grief, and it's very difficult to be unaffected by that.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you for joining us. And thanks to our audience for tuning in to Criminal Record. If you have a question for the team, you can email reporters@dailyrecord.co.uk with the subject line Criminal Record. We'll be back next week. In the meantime, you can subscribe to listen to this podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts by searching for Criminal Record, or you can watch it each week on our YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us.